Comrades, listen. Stop for a moment and ask yourselves, who truly lives in this world? Is it the man shackled to a clock, the woman bending under endless toil, the youth whose dreams are mortgaged to survive, or is it the faceless capitalist, the few who reap where others sow, who measure life in profit, not in joy? When work controls life, life ceases to belong to those who live it. Every hour of labor extracted from the worker is a theft from the self, a sequestration of freedom. The capitalist calls it efficiency, progress, responsibility, but it is nothing more than theft cloaked in civility. It is the machinery of oppression that transforms men and women into instruments of production, stripped of their creativity, their spirit, their humanity. Look around. The laborer works from dawn to dusk, yet the fruits of that labor flow upward, fattening the coffers of the few. The worker produces value beyond their own needs, yet remains impoverished. The capitalist grows in comfort, while the worker's body and mind are spent. Is this not absurdity? Is this not injustice? History demands that we call it by its true name, exploitation. We are told that this is natural, inevitable, that life is defined by our work and our worth is measured by productivity. But let us see through the veil of ideology. The truth, etched in every factory, every office, every wage slip, is that the system survives by convincing the many that they must surrender their lives to labor, that resistance is futile, that liberty is illusion. This is the most insidious form of control, not chains and cages, but the belief that chains do not exist. Yet, comrades, there is a spark in every oppressed heart. The laboring classes, the farmers, the clerks, the teachers, the artisans, the uncounted millions. Our collective power is vast. It is not in the scraps we are allowed to keep, but in the work we do together. Alone, a single worker can be crushed, but united, we are unstoppable. Collective organization, consciousness of our exploitation, the refusal to accept life on terms dictated by another, this is the path to liberation. We must understand that the abolition of alienation is not a moral plea, it is historical necessity. When labor ceases to dominate life, when work becomes a tool of expression rather than a chain, humanity awakens. We must seize the means of production, not for private gain, but to restore life to the living, to reclaim time, to reclaim creativity, to reclaim dignity. Comrades, hear the call of history. The chains that bind our bodies begin with the control of our hours, our energy, our very existence. Let us break these chains. Let us rise with the knowledge that life belongs to those who live it, not to those who exploit it. Let us organize, let us demand, let us act. The world we inherit will be defined not by the hours we give to others, but by the freedom we seize for ourselves. Remember, when work controls life, life dies in the hands of the exploited. But when the workers unite, when labor serves humanity and not capital, life blooms in our hands, powerful and unshackled. The time for subjugation is over. The time for revolution is now. Workers of all trades, unite. Reclaim your lives. Reclaim your freedom. Reclaim your world. When labor dominates life, it does not merely consume hours or drain energy. It reaches into the very essence of human existence and distorts it. Under the system of private property and capitalist production, the worker is compelled to sell not just their physical effort, but their very time, their capacity for thought, their creativity, and their spirit. This is the first and most profound form of oppression, the alienation of the individual from themselves. In every act of labor within this system, the worker is separated from the product of their work. The shoes, the furniture, the machinery, the bread that they produce does not belong to them. It exists as a commodity in the hands of another, something external, something foreign. It is a manifestation of their labor, but stripped of their control, of their ownership, of their claim. The worker's effort becomes an instrument not of self-expression or fulfillment, but of another's accumulation. In this way, the more the worker labors, the more they lose themselves, and the more the product of their life grows alien to them. This alienation extends beyond the tangible objects of labor. It reaches into the worker's consciousness and sense of self. In the capitalist system, the worker is valued not for their intellect, their creativity, or their capacity for innovation, but for their ability to perform repetitive mechanized tasks that generate surplus value for the capitalist. Every hour spent at the factory bench or the office desk is an hour that does not nourish the mind, an hour that diminishes autonomy, an hour that reinforces dependence. The human being, reduced to a tool for production, experiences life not as a realm of possibility, but as a series of obligations imposed by the market. Their own desires, their own aspirations, their own potential are subordinated to the demands of profit. And in this subordination, the worker experiences a profound estrangement from what it means to live fully. Labor under capitalism is also structured to isolate the individual from the collective strength of society. In pre-capitalist forms of production, work often involved communal effort, shared responsibility, and the satisfaction of creating something together. Under capitalism, however, labor is segmented, mechanized, and divided into repetitive fragments. Each worker is confined to a narrow task, responsible for a small portion of the process, incapable of seeing or controlling the whole. This fragmentation not only reduces the quality and creativity of the work, but reinforces the sense of isolation, of being a single cog in a machine whose purpose is dictated by forces beyond comprehension or control. The worker becomes alienated not only from their product, but from the broader activity of human production, from the labor of their peers, and ultimately from society itself. The domination of labor over life also manifests in the control of time. Under capitalism, time ceases to be a personal resource or a measure of meaningful activity. It becomes a currency sold to survive. Work hours are dictated by the rhythms of production, the schedules of management, and the imperatives of efficiency. The worker's day is planned not around their own needs, desires, or community, but around the extraction of labor for profit. The very passage of time, the essence of existence, is converted into a mechanism of control. The worker's life is consumed by labor, leaving little space for self-reflection, for family, for education, for art, for joy. Life becomes subordinated to work, and in that subordination the worker's experience of existence is hollowed, mechanized, and estranged from the rich possibilities of being human. Moreover, this domination creates a moral and psychological estrangement. The worker is taught to internalize the rules of the system, to accept the hierarchy, to measure their worth by output and efficiency. The capitalist ideology presents this submission as natural, as inevitable, as morally justified. The worker comes to see their oppression as deserved, their exploitation as normal. In this way, the domination of labor over life extends into thought itself. Alienation is not merely external, it is internalized, shaping identity, self-perception, and aspirations. Thus, when labor controls life, it enforces a multidimensional oppression that is economic, social, and psychological. The worker is alienated from the product, from the process, from society, from time, and from self. Work ceases to be an expression of human capacity or a means of realizing personal potential. It becomes a mechanism of survival imposed by structures designed to extract value for others. The life of the worker is not lived on their own terms. It is consumed by forces beyond their control, their activity turned against them in the service of another's wealth and power. The human being becomes a means to an end rather than an end in themselves, and in this transformation, the fundamental essence of life, its autonomy, creativity, and vitality, is distorted and suppressed. In the capitalist system, The labor of the many is transformed into wealth for the few. This is not an accidental outcome, nor is it the product of chance or the natural order of society. It is the essential mechanism by which capitalism sustains itself. Every worker produces more than what is necessary for their own survival, yet the surplus of that labor does not return to them. The fruits of their effort, whether measured in wages, comfort, or leisure, are dwarfed by the immense wealth accumulated by those who own the means of production. The capitalist class does not labor in the same sense. They do not create value through their own hands. Instead, they appropriate the value produced by the labor of others, and through this appropriation, their power is reinforced, their wealth compounded, and their dominance perpetuated. This extraction of value is both systematic and invisible, woven into the very structure of economic life so that it appears natural, inevitable, and justified. The worker, in selling their labor, receives only a fraction of what they create. This fraction, called wages, is presented as compensation, yet it is deliberately calibrated to meet the minimum requirements of survival. The difference between what the worker produces and what they receive is surplus value, the cornerstone of capitalist profit. The more intense the labor, the longer the hours, the more skill applied, the greater the surplus extracted. And yet, this surplus does not benefit the laborer. It flows to the capitalist, reinforcing the inequality at the heart of the system. Every machine, every factory, every transaction is organized to maximize this extraction, to convert the energy, creativity, and vitality of millions into material advantage for a tiny minority. In this way, the wealth of the few is built directly upon the toil of the many, and the illusion of fairness is maintained by ideology, by law, by custom, and by the coercive force of the state when necessary. This exploitation is not only economic, but social. It shapes the structures of society, determining who has access to education, health, and opportunity, who can participate fully in public life, and who must struggle to survive from day to day. The capitalist system organizes resources and institutions in a way that preserves the advantages of those who control capital, while limiting the mobility and influence of those who labor. It is a system designed not merely for profit, but for the preservation of power, where the accumulation of wealth is inseparable from the accumulation of authority and influence. The few who hold capital dictate the conditions of work, the rhythm of production, and the distribution of goods. They determine the political discourse, shape culture, and define what is considered valuable, ethical, and necessary. Meanwhile, the majority, whose labor sustains the system, are denied the full benefits of their contributions, constrained by wages, debts, and obligations that ensure their continued dependence. The capitalist system also obscures the reality of this exploitation. Workers are encouraged to view wages as fair compensation, to accept the difference between labor and reward as a natural reflection of ability, intelligence, or effort. The ideology of meritocracy, of personal responsibility, and of competition convinces the laboring masses that their deprivation is deserved, that inequality is inevitable, and that the accumulation of wealth by the few is justified. Yet, when examined objectively, the imbalance is stark and undeniable. The labor of the many produces far more value than is returned to them, while the idle consumption of the few grows without limit. The system thrives by hiding the mechanisms of extraction, by presenting what is exploitation as voluntary, and by framing the accumulation of wealth as a reward for enterprise rather than the product of appropriation. Capitalism, therefore, is not a neutral framework for trade or production. It is a structure built upon systematic extraction and enforced inequality. It depends on the obedience of the many, the acceptance of their subordinate position, and the internalization of ideology that justifies their labor as necessary and natural. It ensures that wealth flows upward, consolidates power, and reproduces itself through institutions, education and law. The rich grow richer not through their own labor, but through the continuous, often invisible, labor of the masses, whose daily toil produces both the goods and the conditions that sustain the lives and luxuries of the few. Every factory, office and farm becomes a site of this extraction, where value is created collectively but enjoyed privately, where the many contribute and the few consume, where the rhythm of production is measured not by human need but by the accumulation of capital. In capitalist society, oppression is not maintained solely by force, nor by laws and police alone. It is maintained most powerfully by ideology. The system persuades the oppressed to accept their own subjugation, to believe the surrender of their time, energy and labor is not only necessary but natural. From birth, the worker is immersed in narratives that shape perception, values and desires, teaching that toil is the measure of virtue, that the accumulation of capital is proof of worth, and that the endless cycle of labor is the proper rhythm of life. Education, religion, media, and culture all work to reinforce this belief, presenting the conditions of exploitation as moral order, as common sense, as the only reality in which life can exist. The oppressed internalize these messages, and in doing so, they begin to participate in their own domination, seeing their constraints as unavoidable rather than imposed, their suffering as inevitable rather than constructed. This ideological control operates through multiple channels. Workers are taught that success is individual, that failure is a personal flaw, and that inequality is a natural consequence of talent, diligence, or luck. They are encouraged to compete with one another, to view peers not as allies but as rivals, to perceive collaboration as a threat to personal advancement. In doing so, solidarity is undermined, and the very potential for collective resistance is weakened. The system ensures that the laborer measures life according to the standards set by the oppressor, evaluates freedom by the approval of the powerful, and accepts scarcity and deprivation as deserved. Every hour spent at the factory, the office, or the farm is reinforced by a narrative that normalizes subordination, turning what is externally imposed into an internalized law. The extraction of labor is thus accompanied by the extraction of consciousness. The worker does not simply sell their time. They are trained to see this transaction as inevitable, as the expression of choice rather than necessity. They are persuaded to identify with the goals of the employer, to find dignity in obedience, to equate survival with submission. The capitalist system disguises itself as neutrality or benevolence, masking domination with the language of opportunity, merit, and fairness. In this way, the worker's own judgment is co-opted, and the very tools of thought, perception, evaluation, aspiration, are shaped to align with the interests of those who exploit. The oppressed internalize the values and priorities of the oppressor, turning ideological control into a force as strong as physical coercion. This manipulation extends to time and energy, the most precious commodities of human life. Workers are convinced that the long hours, the exhaustion, and the sacrifice of leisure are necessary, natural, and virtuous. They are taught that to resist, to demand more of life than the system allows, is selfish, dangerous, or unrealistic. Every hour surrendered to labor is framed as part of the moral order. Every moment of fatigue and struggle is normalized, and every aspiration beyond subsistence is deemed a distraction or indulgence. In this way, the system ensures that oppression continues without overt violence, that compliance is voluntary, and that the potential for rebellion is diminished. Ideology as control also shapes the understanding of freedom itself. Freedom is presented not as the ability to live according to one's own desires, to shape one's own time, or to participate fully in the collective creation of society, but as the ability to survive within the boundaries defined by capital. The worker is taught to value the reward offered for submission rather than the liberation denied to them. By redefining desires, aspirations, and expectations, The system converts resistance into resignation, imagination into calculation, and life into a series of obligations to external interests rather than internal necessities. The oppressed come to accept their exploitation as natural, a law written in the very fabric of life rather than in the structures of domination. The true power of ideology is that it hides the mechanisms of exploitation while ensuring their continuity. By convincing workers that submission is inevitable, the system turns obedience into a habit, internalizes oppression, and transforms the very consciousness of the oppressed. Labor is not only performed but rationalized. Alienation is not only endured but justified, and the surrender of life, energy, and creativity is interpreted as a moral duty rather than a social imposition. The mind becomes a site of control, as decisive as the factory or office, and the capacity for critical understanding, for recognition of injustice, and for collective resistance is blunted before it can manifest. The oppressed are not powerless, though the system works ceaselessly to convince them otherwise. It is not the solitary worker who can overturn exploitation, but the worker united with comrades, the countless hands, minds and hearts that form a collective force greater than the sum of its parts. Throughout history, the strength of the individual has been subordinated to systems of authority, yet the collective, once conscious of its shared interest, becomes the decisive agent of transformation. Capitalism depends upon division, on the isolation of labor, on convincing the worker that their struggle is theirs alone. But when that isolation is broken, when solidarity replaces competition, the balance of power shifts. Workers organized, aware of the common origin of their exploitation, capable of coordinated action, are a force that no accumulation of wealth, no army of enforcement, and no ideological manipulation can fully contain. The realization of this power begins with consciousness, the recognition that the chains binding one worker are the same chains binding millions, that oppression is systemic, and that liberation requires unity rather than individual endurance. The power of collective action lies not only in numbers but in understanding. A group of workers acting in concert, informed of the mechanisms of exploitation and the true source of wealth, transforms mere resistance into strategic, decisive action. Strikes, boycotts, cooperative enterprises, and political engagement are not random acts of rebellion, they are the calculated expression of the worker's inherent strength. In solidarity, labor ceases to be a commodity exploited passively and becomes an instrument of power. The production process itself becomes a site of negotiation, leverage, and assertion, as the withdrawal of labor from the system reveals the system's dependence on those it claims to dominate. Every hour refused, every demand articulated, every union formed or assembly convened is a reminder that capital cannot exist without the active participation of labor. The collective presence of workers transforms vulnerability into leverage, marginality into influence, and subjugation into the foundation of systemic change. Collective action also creates consciousness among the oppressed. When workers unite, they share not only grievances but understanding, strategy, and vision. Isolation breeds despair and resignation. Cooperation breeds insight and courage. Through shared struggle, the worker begins to recognize that their labor is not merely a private transaction, but part of a social and economic system that can be challenged, reshaped, and ultimately transformed. The act of uniting, of organizing, is itself educational. It illuminates the structural dynamics of exploitation, demonstrates the possibility of resistance, and reveals the mutual dependence of workers across industries, regions, and social strata. The collective mind of the working class becomes both shield and weapon, capable of defending immediate rights while laying the groundwork for broader transformation. The potential of unified workers extends beyond economic leverage to political and social transformation. While the ruling class relies on wealth, institutions, and ideology to maintain dominance, the organized worker can contest these structures directly. Political engagement, mass mobilization, and cooperative self-management of production create alternatives to capitalist control, demonstrating that society can function according to principles of equity, justice, and shared benefit. Workers united do not merely react, they innovate, constructing models of society where life and labor are harmonized, where production serves human need rather than private profit. In unity, workers are empowered to redefine the very terms of social organization, to reclaim not just wages but autonomy, not just time but freedom, not just survival but the possibility of a life fully lived. Furthermore, collective action disrupts the ideological control that sustains capitalism. When workers organize, the narrative of inevitability begins to crumble. The system can no longer claim that oppression is natural or unchangeable, for the visible demonstration of solidarity and resistance reveals its artificial and contingent nature. Mass movements expose the mechanisms of exploitation, challenge the legitimacy of authority, and inspire confidence in those who had been led to believe that their struggle was isolated and futile. In this sense, unity is both protective and revolutionary. It shields the worker from the corrosive effects of isolation, while simultaneously serving as the engine of systemic change. The historical record confirms the transformative power of collective action. From strikes that forced the recognition of labor rights to revolutions that reshaped nations, from workers' councils that seized control of production to cooperative movements that created alternatives to capitalist exploitation, unity has been the precondition of emancipation. Individual courage is fleeting, but collective determination endures. Organized workers, acting with consciousness and discipline, become the architects of their own liberation, capable of confronting entrenched power, dismantling systems of oppression, and reconstructing society in alignment with principles of justice and human dignity. True liberation cannot be achieved as long as the worker remains a mere instrument of profit, as long as labor exists to enrich others rather than to fulfill human need. Under capitalism, life itself is subordinated to the dictates of capital. Every hour, every effort, every aspiration is measured against the accumulation of wealth rather than the flourishing of humanity. To reclaim life is to overturn this inversion, to restore labor to its proper purpose, the expression of human creativity, the satisfaction of collective needs, and the cultivation of freedom. When work ceases to be a commodity to be sold for survival and becomes instead a means through which people realize their potential, society itself is transformed. Labor is no longer a chain, no longer a source of alienation and exhaustion, but a tool for human development and communal well-being, a vehicle through which individuals contribute to a world that serves life rather than capital. The reclamation of life requires not only the redistribution of wealth, but the restructuring of the very conditions under which work is organized. When the instruments and processes of production are controlled by those who labor, not by those who exploit, work becomes an act of agency rather than subjugation. The worker is no longer alienated from the product of their effort, because they determine both the purpose and the use of what is produced. Time is no longer measured in terms of profit, but in terms of human needs and desires. Skills and creativity are not commodified for someone else's gain, but nurtured for the collective benefit. This transformation is not superficial. It alters the relationship between human beings and the material world, aligning labor with life, sustenance, and freedom rather than scarcity, debt, and domination. Reclaiming life also involves the dissolution of hierarchical power structures that separate the worker from control over their environment and society. Capitalist society trains individuals to accept the authority of owners, managers, and institutions as natural arbiters of value, deciding what is produced, how it is produced, and for whom. Liberation requires reversing this dynamic, placing decision-making power into the hands of those who perform the labor. This does not mean replacing one ruling class with another, but creating collective structures in which people directly shape the economic and social forces that determine their lives. Work becomes democratic, accountable, and aligned with the collective good. Human time, energy, and intelligence are no longer consumed by systems designed to extract value for the few, but devoted to sustaining and enriching the life of the many. Freedom, in this sense, is inseparable from the transformation of labor itself. The worker cannot be free while their labor is alienated, while they are compelled to produce for someone else's wealth, while their time is subordinated to machines of exploitation. Liberation requires both material and intellectual autonomy, the capacity to pursue meaningful activity, to develop skills, to engage in creativity, and to participate fully in society. When labor serves humanity rather than capital, the oppressive division between production and life disappears. Work becomes an avenue for self-expression, social cohesion, and fulfillment, rather than a source of oppression, fatigue, and alienation. Every act of production contributes to the enrichment of life, not the enrichment of the few, and in this alignment, human potential is released and nurtured. Moreover, reclaiming life requires a moral and ideological shift. Society must redefine success, value, and progress, no longer measuring human worth by productivity or accumulation, but by capacity for contribution, cooperation, and development. Education, culture, and institutions must reflect these principles, cultivating consciousness, critical thinking, and solidarity. Labor, freed from its servitude to capital, becomes a source of empowerment, a means of building knowledge, community, and shared well-being. The liberated worker is no longer alienated from themselves, their community, or the product of their efforts. They participate fully in the creation of a society that prioritizes life, creativity, and freedom over profit, control, and accumulation. Historically, this vision is evident in movements and experiments where communities have sought to align production with human needs. Collective farming, workers' councils, cooperatives, and other forms of self-managed production demonstrate the potential for labor to serve life rather than capital. These examples illuminate the path to liberation, showing that the subordination of labor to wealth is not eternal or natural, but contingent and reversible. Through solidarity, organization, and conscious struggle, the working class can seize the means of production, restructure society, and create conditions under which labor enhances life rather than consumes it. The reclamation of life and freedom is therefore the culmination of revolutionary struggle, the fulfillment of human potential suppressed under capitalism, and the restoration of labor to its rightful place as a servant of humanity. It demands the overthrow of structures that treat people as instruments, the reconstruction of society around collective needs, and the alignment of work with creativity, fulfillment, and shared purpose. In doing so, humanity recovers the time, energy, and autonomy that have been stolen, transforming labor from a source of alienation into the foundation of freedom. Comrades, the truth is clear. The chains that bind us are not natural, they are constructed. The alienation we endure is not inevitable, it is imposed. The wealth we produce is not for ourselves, it is stolen. The domination of labor over life, the extraction of value for the enrichment of the few, the ideological deception that convinces us to accept our own oppression, these are the weapons of a system designed to subjugate humanity. But we are not powerless. When we recognize the mechanisms of exploitation, when we see through the lies that divide us, when we unite in conscious collective action, the balance of power shifts. Our labor, our time, our energy, becomes not a tool of submission, but an instrument of liberation. True freedom begins when work serves humanity, not capital, when life is reclaimed from the machinery of exploitation, when creativity, solidarity and purpose guide production rather than profit. The path forward demands that we rise together, that we organize, that we demand control over our labor, our time, and our society. Every act of unity, every assertion of rights, every struggle for dignity strengthens our power and illuminates the possibilities of a world where life is truly our own. The history of oppression is long, but so too is the capacity of the oppressed to awaken, to act, and to reshape the world. Let us therefore cast off the illusion that subjugation is natural, reject the notion that our time belongs to another, and reclaim the fullness of life that has been denied to us. Workers of all trades, all regions, all walks of life, our strength lies in our solidarity, our liberation lies in our unity, and our future lies in a world where labor exists to serve life itself. The chains of alienation, the concentration of wealth, the lies of ideology, these will not endure against the conscious collective power of those who refuse to surrender their lives. We must act, we must organize, and we must insist that life, labor, and freedom belong to those who live them.